Hi, this is the video for Daf Mem Het of Masechet Ketubot. I wanted to go over some of the basics of how Jewish marriage worked, at least in the Talmudic period. It's a little bit different, and I'll explain that later on in this video. And to talk a little bit about why the rabbis are so obsessed with a particular point. So the Mishnah on the second half, or the end of Mem Het Amud Aleph, and goes on to the second half of Mem Het Amud Bet, talks about at what point does a woman move from being betrothed to being married. So this was a good opportunity to go back to the basics of how Jewish marriage worked back then, at least in rabbinic eyes, and what the points of confusion were. There are two stages in Jewish marriage. One we call kiddushin in the rabbinic word, and the Toraitic word, the word in the Torah, is erusin. And the rabbinic word for marriage, which doesn't really appear all that much in the Torah, is nisuin. So in English, we would call that today betrothal and marriage. Now, let's take it one at a time. What is betrothal? First of all, betrothal is something that occurs while the girl still remains in her father's house. That seems to be really the essence of betrothal, is that the couple, the husband and the wife, or the family of the husband and the wife, make a commitment that this marriage will occur, and that is when the man would say to the woman, again, this is according to classical Talmudic law, Hare at mekudeshet li, behold, you are betrothed to me, or one of the other forms of kiddushin mentioned at the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin, but the norm would be to say it and to give her an object of value. Now, the important point to remember is that in Jewish law, betrothal is very, very strong, right? Far stronger than it is in the modern equivalent engagement. And by that I mean, today, if somebody breaks off an engagement, the consequences are not all that great. There may be some social consequences. There may be some potential little bit of legal consequences, but not very much. They don't require a divorce. And it's basically just almost like breaking up a relationship that has very little commitment. Unlike that, in Jewish law, once a girl is betrothed, should she sleep with another man, that's considered adultery for both parties, as we've learned before. And she's really, to a certain extent, fully committed to being with that husband. But the one exception is she has not yet moved into his house, and therefore it's either forbidden or certainly not expected that they will be having marital relationships. So a lot of this, that you can see how a little bit fuzzier it is, where we have this weak form of engagement, and marriage is pretty much the whole thing. And truth be told, Jewish law works the same way today. We do betrothal and marriage under the chuppah, and so we've conflated, from the Middle Ages, we've conflated those two stages into one stage. But in Talmudic times, they did kiddushin first, so the woman was fully committed to the man, and the man was pretty much fully committed to the woman. Of course, he could divorce her, but aside from divorcing her, he was fully committed to marrying the woman, and that was the stage of betrothal. The stage of marriage was quite simply her moving from her father's house into her husband's house, and that we can see reflected in this Mishnah. Even the word chuppah, which we take as a symbolic bridal canopy, probably means quite frequently not something symbolic, but a real room or a real bridal chamber that was part of his house, that was meant to be, where they were going to live. At least more than just symbolic, was a real room, and as we're going to see later on in the Masechet, it was assumed that they would have sexual relations in the chuppah, something that nobody, hopefully, does today. So that's how marriage worked back then. Again, there was a two-stage. Betrothal, she remains in her father's house. Nisuin, she goes to her husband's house. I don't think this happened 100% of the time, but that was assumed to be the norm. And so the rabbis are constantly asking questions of two natures. One is, when does this exactly happen? When does she leave her father's house that she's considered married? And when does she enter her husband's house so that she's considered married? And what happens if something happens on the way? And they ask all sorts of questions throughout the whole Masechet about the ramifications of that middle status. Rabbis are very interested in these unclear statuses, right? Parts of days that are unclear, things that are doubtful this and doubtful that. And an Arusa is fascinating to them because she's a little bit like a married woman, but she's a little bit not like a married woman, right? And I think that more than just being a practical issue, it's a gray area, and the rabbis love to talk about gray areas. The end of a day, bein hashmashot, the twilight, is that the previous day or the next day? Doubtfully tithed produce, do we treat that as tithed produce? Do we not treat that as tithed produce? The list could go on and on. It's one of the topics that fascinates the rabbis, and we're going to see this Arusa, in my opinion, is one of the grayest of all categories, meaning one of the most uncertain category, and that's why the rabbis focus so much on discussing it. And there are also very many potential ramifications, including inheritance, financial responsibilities. Where does the dowry go? Is he responsible for feeding her? And the issue of, does she get to eat truma, which comes up in this stuff. So it's something to look out for as we go through the rest of the chapter and the rest of the Masechet. What is the status of the Arusa, the betrothed woman? Is she considered like a married woman, or is she considered not to be a married woman?